It just told me we're being recorded. How about that? So, of course, it's one of those things where it falls right underneath that umbrella, and we get so hopefully we'll get a chance to really kind of talk about that and get some information. For those of you who just got on who didn't hear me tell the others earlier, you want to make sure you get something to write with and something to write on. Because we will have some things that I'll ask you to do as we go along today, at least one, essentially. And so as we're talking today, you see here on the slides that we are talking about resilience, and we're talking about resilience specifically in communities of color, but just as well, just resilience in general. And so in doing that, you'll hear me talk a lot about the differences between stress and anxiety, right? Two of my specialties, right? So you'll hear me talk a lot about and use the term stress and anxiety. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page first before we go on and move forward in regards to what those are, because oftentimes, just for the most part, we tend to just use those words interchangeably. Oh, I feel stressed or anxious, and it's all, as if it's all the same. And so I do want to make sure we talk about that first before we jump into it. Before I get into that, I will put my email address in the chat box, because I know that there's going to be a lot of questions afterwards. I know that as we're talking right now, we're hearing about, eventually we'll hear about the verdict in the Chauvin case or whatnot. And so we know that those things are going to be coming out. So if you have questions and if I can help, definitely shoot me an email. And I'll help you either find someone to talk to about it, because these things do hit us hard sometimes. And I think it's important to recognize that we all should have a therapist, right? In my opinion, I think that everybody should have a therapist, because you'd be surprised how bogged down you are. What we get over time in regards to all of the things that kind of happen to us or happen around us, essentially. So, and I think that we don't always give mental health the same level of respect that we give physical health. So, of course, you're going to hear me over the time that we have together today, encouraging you to, if you don't have a therapist, get a therapist. If you don't have someone that you feel like you can really talk to, definitely find a therapist that you can talk to, somebody who you can trust, and I can help you in that process if you need that help or whatnot. There's so many different resources out there, and of course, there's my email address for that. So, as Corey said, we're going to jump in. If you have questions, definitely unmute yourself or use the chat box. I'll do my very best to answer all of your questions and give feedback, that kind of thing. And as I said before, I want to kind of make sure that we understand the difference between stress and anxiety. So we know that stress is our mind and our body's avoidant response to change. So when you hear me say stress, think of change, right? And having an avoidant response to change. When I'm talking about anxiety, I'm talking about fears. That means that your brain is responding to something in a fearful way. So it's it's a fearful response to something that may or may not happen in the future, whether it's 10 seconds in the future or 10 years in the future. So you want to make sure that as you hear me say these terms and you're trying to pay attention to, hey, am I stressed or am I anxious or am I feeling something else? I want you to think about those terms in those two different forms. And although the symptoms might look the same, the root cause is very different. So you would respond to them very differently, right? It's almost like saying the difference between the flu and allergies. Like the symptoms might look the same, but the root cause is different. So that means that the treatment is going to be different. You wouldn't take allergy medicine for the flu, and you wouldn't take the flu medicine for allergies. Some of us might, but it usually doesn't work well if you do, right? So essentially, when you hear me talking about the differences, when you hear me using the terms, I should say, stress and anxiety, I want you to think about stress is change, anxiety is fear, right? Stress is change, and specifically an avoidant response to change, which means we don't want that change to happen. And so we'll talk about that a lot today, and you'll hear me use the term stress a whole lot today, especially as it relates to all of the changes that have happened over this last year, right? We've all been bombarded with change, whether we wanted to have it or not. And that's on top of the changes that we had in our personal lives. I'm talking about just the macro changes for COVID and social unrest and the different political climates that we've dealt with over this last year, and actually year and some change at this point. So remember, I wish we were all in the same room, right? Because I would have you all tell me stress, right, is change and dealing with change. Anxiety is dealing with fear. I want you to make sure you recognize the differences between those two. Now, this is where we get the chance to talk a little bit about, again, the differences between stress and change. And we know that with everything that's kind of been going on, we have these impending uncertainties of the coronavirus pandemic, that to some of the renewed questions and flashpoints around systemic racism that kind of happened, to a pervasive sense of a country that seems divided over this last year. And it feels like we're living through some of the most challenging times some of us can ever remember, essentially. And it's easy to really feel this sense of doom, that these events are really kind of too much for us to handle, especially in the context of all of the other stressors we have to navigate and just to manage in our everyday lives. Remember, there's these macro things that we're all experiencing, and then we have our own individual stuff that comes with being in school, or having family challenges, or just getting used to what it means to have to transition from being on campus versus doing online school, or taking classes online if you had to make that major shift. And we know that the stronger excuse me, that you're stronger than you know. And this is one of the things that I think is important. And you'll hear me say this over and over again as we're talking about resilience, because we come equipped with this secret weapon that is called our natural resilience. We all have it. And we also have the power to build it up in order to meet the demands of the stress that we experience, right? The changes that we experience. And so we're going to talk about resilience as a way to treat or try to manage the stress. Now, it will help with anxiety as well, but as we're talking about anxiety and we're talking about fears, having those fearful thoughts, it's going to take more intentionality. You're going to have to be more purposeful in regards to managing anxiety. So it'll help with that. But again, I encourage you to utilize a therapist or get that help if you feel like you're having anxiety to the point where it's starting to directly impact your daily life, essentially, right? Because it takes a lot more. You'll hear me use that term, but we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on managing stress. As you see on the screen, we have 3 goals for today, right? We're going to review the factors that are making life more challenging today. Then we're going to discuss what it means to be resilient during these stressful times. And then we're going to learn some strategies to be able to tap into your own personal resilience as we kind of meet these challenges. And I think that although you'll hear me talk about all of the things that are happening right now, these are tools that you can take on today and then take with you forever. And remember, if nothing else, knowledge does not facilitate change, action does. So whatever you grasp today, whatever you get from today, take it and figure out a way to put it into action, right? Because you can know any and everything, but if you don't do anything with the information you gather, then you're still going to know it and things still won't change, essentially. So I'm going to ask you to do something for me before we jump into the stressful times, right? I'm going to ask you to take your writing utensil and something to write with, and something to write on, I should say. I'm going to ask you to write your full name in cursive. And yes, I just aged myself, didn't I, for some of you who know. So I'm going to ask you to write your name in cursive. Your full name. If you have 3 names, write all 3 names. If you have 12 names, write all 12 names in cursive. Now, I'm going to ask you to take your writing utensil and put it in your other hand and do the same thing. So who wants to share with me, either in the chat or unmute yourself? What was it like to write with your non-dominant hand? Uncomfortable, thank you. Anyone else want to share? Most people say things uncomfortable, it took longer, challenging, embarrassing. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. Embarrassing, awkward, right? It might have taken more time. Some people may have even kind of just given up, right? Because you're like, I can't do this. There's no point in me doing this, right? Or you might have wanted to give up, but said, I like frustrating is one too. You might have wanted to give up, but you chose not to because you said, well, I want to see what she's going to do. But in other situations, you might have given up, right? So a lot of overthinking, that's really a good one. You had to think more, it took more energy, it took more effort. And so I appreciate you all for sharing. Keep coming with how it felt. as I explained to you why I had you do that, right? So I've asked you to do that because when we're talking about managing stress, right, so that we can get into using resilience as a means to manage that, right, to help us to manage it effectively. The thing that we need to manage when it comes to stress is the mental and emotional components of it, because we know that stress is a mental and emotional experience. And so what you felt, right, that difficulty, the messy, that you judged yourself in that, you found yourself overthinking, you found yourself, thanks Paul for sharing that. You found yourself feeling awkward or embarrassed. All of those things kind of happened in a way where, excuse me, that's the stuff that you have to get through anytime change happens. Anytime you're confronted with a change, that is your initial response to that change, right? So not only do you have to deal with the change, you have to deal with the thoughts and the feelings that come with that change. And so as we're talking about some of the tips and tricks that we'll talk about in regards to using your resilience, the first thing you want to do is accept how you respond to change. And you now are a guru in your own personal response to change. So as we're talking today, and you're writing down all of these great tips that I talk about in regards to resilience, I'm going to ask you to also remember that you are dealing with that specific thing that came up for you, right? That specific thing. So if it was feeling embarrassed or you felt challenged to the point where, or frustrated essentially, then just understand that that is your initial response to it. And so now you have to deal with that frustration. You have to deal with that embarrassment. You have to deal with that overthinking that happened, right, in order for you to be able to tap into and effectively tap into resilient strategies. So I'm going to leave that there for a second. I'm going to ask you to remember that throughout the time. Remember your personal experience throughout the rest of the time we have together, and we'll come back to that hopefully as we have time. So we know that, as I said before, you'll hear me use the words stress and anxiety and worry, and we know that all of these things are really a natural part of life. And this is often especially true in college. We know that acclimating to the work that you have to do, and being away from home and having these new routines and so on, and having to have these routines in a place and that's away from home, and then having to go back and forth for those of you who are maybe like upperclassmen and this is something you're used to at this point. And all of these things can cause stress to spike, right? Because again, stress is change. So every time we have to deal with a change, your experience or your personal experience with stress is going to spike. And that was before the pandemic even happened. This is just how our brain and our body works. And so we know that since last spring, when COVID-19 became a known threat, we've all been doing our very, very, very best to really kind of figure out how to navigate this extra layer, these new layers of stress, and this thing that's been ongoing for over a year. And it's been so uniquely stressful and challenging, and it's all become part of our experiences. And this because, the risk is everywhere, right? And ongoing at this point. Even now, the disease remains unseen, unpredictable, and even though we know that some of the vaccines do bring hope, we still can't look ahead and anticipate a return to what is really what we would consider normal. There's also a lot of us who are not sure what that normal is going to look like or what it's going to feel like. I've talked to a couple of people who've gone to large events since getting vaccinated, and it was awkward to even start talking to people again. And these are people who were extroverts before the pandemic, and they became more introverted over time, or they tapped more into that. And then the other thing about this is that the impact has been widespread. We've had to navigate massive change and losses of all sorts. Some of the norms or routines or jobs, schools, and even loss of loved ones, essentially. And we worry about our own health and friends and families and affecting others. And we're to the point where other people have become really kind of threats to us, where you're walking down the street and you feel like you have to cross the street just to walk past someone, essentially. And we know that the college experience has also been altered in so many different ways. So for example, we know that virtual learning can be problematic. I know for me, I teach some classes online sometimes, and I know that there's some technology glitches that can happen, the loss of group interactivity. Some of us may really miss being able to talk to people and feel their energy in person. And we know that many students actually say that it's just not the same, especially if this isn't your first year, right, in college, essentially. And it's just not the same. You don't get to go out and have that full, what would be considered college experience. And so we know that the ability to stay motivated and really perform at a high level may actually be compromised for many of us. And this can really trigger some anxiety about performance. again, right? Some fear about performance and what the long-term impact on future prospects may be, essentially. And so we're also struggling with isolation for many of us, the loss of connection, especially in college, at a time when it's really kind of normal for you to focus on making connections and networking and things like that. And this can really have a profound effect on the mental and emotional health and their energy and their motivation as well. So, meanwhile, with all of that happening, we've lost many of the ways that we could normally cope or de-stress, right? Or manage the changes that are happening, like going to the gym, gathering with family and friends, and taking spring break, and all of these different things, like going places for spring break. And we know that while there are some practical challenges in all of this, much of the stress we feel can really trace back to the core sense of what we call a psychological threat. So we know that there's some feelings of uncertainty and vulnerability that always happen, and there's this powerlessness that can really trigger some really kind of deep levels of anxiety, and that really we can carry with us each day if we're not careful. Essentially, we know that the impact of all of this appears to be greater for young adults than that we would consider that anyone between 18 and 24. It seems to be greater. And we've seen that there's about 63% are reporting of individuals between 18 and 24 are actually saying that they've had some level of anxiety or depressive symptoms, essentially, to some level. And so that tells us a lot, right? That tells us a whole lot about what's going on. And that's compared to the 41% that goes for all adults across the board from 18 up, right? So in 2019, that figure was like 11%. So just look at that jump. So at this point, from last year to this year, we've had such a huge jump in individuals experiencing anxiety symptoms and or depressive symptoms. And so with that, I think it's important to recognize what that means for us as we're living in these challenging times. So as we move forward, right, we know that challenges that have spiked over the past year aren't really confined to the pandemic. We know just we're talking about, and I think someone in the chat, Paul, had mentioned that there's that he's been charged guilty on he's been guilty on all charges. So we know that death of George Floyd, and it was really kind of heartbreaking to witness and to actually see and ignite and expand, deep feelings it had that we actually might have tapped into some really deep feelings about systemic racism and policing and being a person of color in America and what that looks like and feels like. And we know that this incident and others before and after, actually, for that matter, even to what just happened in the last week or so, right? Just understanding that it can begin to make you worry about your own safety, along with some deep concerns about some of the injustice and discrimination against people of color that has persisted unchanged over many decades, essentially. We know that viewing the images of these acts of violence and the inescapable sense of injustice can trigger some racial trauma and re-traumatization, I think, in some of us, essentially. So if you find yourself feeling traumatized by seeing it over and over again, you're going to hear me encourage you to utilize a therapist and talk things through, or find someone trusted that you could talk things through with. We know that the pattern of similar events, and for some of us, personal experiences, really kind of makes it hard to escape this sense of outrage and sorrow that has happened once again. And so, though voices for change are growing and things have shifted, our belief in or hope for a just and equal country can feel like an illusion that kind of shakes our moral code and belief in humanity. And there's so many other related events that happen, such as like we're talking about now, and what's happening like literally in this moment, trials of the police officer who killed George Floyd, essentially. All of these things really can kind of bring up more and more challenges or emotions for us. And so we know, and all of this is set in a time of really kind of intense polarization in our country. I think that we're starting to get to a place where we're starting to see some headway in unity, but it feels like we've never been more divided at this point. And this division really does make it harder to see a way forward. So you may find yourself navigating an intense mix of many emotions and feelings, and there can be this push and pull between wishing this would end and that the discomfort would go away, and embracing the anger and sorrows of the drivers as drivers of change, essentially. So we know that this tangle of thoughts and perspectives and emotions can really be overwhelming at times. So let's move forward and talk a little bit about life, stress, and resilience, and start talking about what we came here for, right? We've talked about all of the reasons why you need to tap into resilience. I've told you about stress, and I told you how that we're going to learn how to use resilience to manage this stress. So now you know all of the things, right, that's causing you stress, and we're aware of it, and you even are gurus in how you tend to respond to change, right? Your personal response to change, the things that kind of stop you from wanting to deal with to manage change or deal with things, and causes you to have those the stressful symptoms, right? Like the pain in neck and shoulders, difficulty concentrating, pain, aches and pains, the trouble sleeping, or trouble in your stomach if you have digestive issues, things like that. So we know that we know all of this stuff. Now let's talk about, right, some of the things that really kind of help us. We know that we're talking about that definition of stress, right, is a reminder in our bodies, avoidant response to change. That is the short version of it. And we know that feeling stressed and anxious, emotional, maybe even worry is all part of a completely normal stress reaction. And it's our body's way of saying, this is hard, right? It's really hard and it's important. And I'm not sure I know how to really handle it. I'm not sure. So therefore, I'm going to try to avoid it. So acknowledging this reality, I think, and feeling stressed is a cue, is important, I would say. And feeling stressed is a cue that something matters to you and it's not a weakness. Oftentimes we see having an emotion as a weakness, essentially, and it's actually a good first move to helping ourselves get unstuck and able to respond to this challenge with what we call resilience. So we know that resilience sometimes is this word that sounds like this all-powerful, like kind of hopeful thing. And we love movies and stories about resilient people who somehow beat the odds and just to survive and thrive, right? And some of us may have done this ourselves, but it can be really sometimes kind of hard to imagine ourselves being resilient, especially right now. And it can seem like a quality that's really kind of out of reach, almost like a special trait that keeps some people immune from stress, that weighs us from the stressors that kind of weigh us down. But the reality is that in regards to resilience, it's very different, right? Being resilient is not about being stressed. It is about tapping into the qualities within each of us, right? Tapping into qualities that are inside of you that allows you to respond to the stress in a more healthy and productive and balanced way, right? So these are not superhuman qualities, right? They are ways of thinking and acting that we're all capable of doing. And so I think it's important to recognize that. So using resilience as a response. So we're going to stay here for a moment and just pay attention to how, like I said, we can use resilience to respond to some of their life stressors, those life changes, to help us to be able to manage it a little more effectively. So in many ways, we're predisposed to respond with resilience already. It's almost like our body's natural, like if we allow it to be its natural response, and it's the most adaptive response that we have. And in fact, we adapt to minor stressors every day that don't even register on our consciousness, like riding a bike, right? When we're riding a bike or learning to ride a bike, we tend to shift slightly in order to stay upright so you don't fall, or maybe maneuver around changing terrain, these kind of things. I think it's important to recognize it as that, right? Because that's the same thing we're doing when we're tapping into our resilience. And so at the other end of the spectrum are some of the more life-threatening stressors. A car might veer into your bike lane, and without any conscious thought, you instantly brake or swerve to avoid that crash. But it's all the other stressors that fall somewhere between those extremes on that continuum that we have to kind of pay attention to. And that's where things can really get a little bit sticky. So how we feel and respond is based on how we interpret the situation. So there's a couple of things that I think that we need to pay attention to. So on a subconscious level, we ask ourselves, how harmful is this stressor, right? How harmful is it? Do I have any control over the consequences, or do I have the resources to manage it? Or in other words, can I handle it, or is it too much for me? Our interpretation of that is influenced by a number of factors. One is the stress load is one factor. That's the volume, the intensity, what's at stake essentially. And then we have some vulnerabilities, and these may stem from experiences that we've had, or just be aspects of our makeup. If you believe that you're a worrier by nature, and this is where we talk about like anxiety and whatnot, then the unknowns of the pandemic might be especially challenging for you essentially. But all of us come with this preloaded strength, right, of resilience, and we don't always recognize them in ourselves or how much they actually play a role in how we think and act what they do. And so a strength could be persistence or maybe a sense of humor. And these are our day-to-day strengths that we might tap into and don't even recognize that we do it. And it could also be a strength that comes from external supports, like maybe your friends or your family or your community. And these can shift your interpretation and really kind of offset the impact of stress and support resilience as a response. So are there any questions about anything I've said so far? I know that I'm throwing a lot of information at you, so I want to make sure that I answer any questions or give that opportunity to as we're kind of moving forward. And we can stay here for a bit.
Okay. And I just want to remind everybody, feel free to write your questions in the chat as Dr. Lorrie is going through, and if there's a moment where she breaks and you want to, verbalize your question, just feel free to unmute as well.
Yes. Absolutely. I'm usually pretty good at remembering where I left off. So I can jump back in there, I promise. But this is the last slide, and then we're going to jump into the 4 Ps of resilience. So that's where you're going to want to make sure you also have something to write with and write on as well. So you can take that with you also. So now we're talking about, again, so as Corey and I just reminded you all, definitely make sure that you ask your questions, right? Either through chat or unmute yourself. And we're going to get to the 4 Ps in just a second. So we know that just in talking about resilience in challenging times, sometimes it's hard to really kind of see resilience within ourselves. And I think that that's really interesting. I always find that interesting because it's easier to see. There's an old proverb or so that it's easier to see the log in someone else's eyes the toothpick in someone else's eyes than the log in our own. And it's hard. So that means that, in saying that, I should say, that means that it's really kind of hard to see what's going on with us, right? It's hard we don't want to stop and pay attention to what's actually going on with us in those moments, because it's easier to be able to look at something that's already done and kind of evaluate that than it is to really kind of take hold and really pay attention to what's going on with us. And so you're going to hear me encouraging you to do that. And if you do as I suggested before and get yourself a therapist, of course, they're going to have you doing the same thing. But I think it's sometimes hard, all of that to say, to really kind of see resilience and see some of the positive things that we have going on for ourselves. But it's very, very, very important to recognize that we all have it within us. We may not always be able to see it when we're feeling stuck or overwhelmed, but it's there. And that's one of the most important things. If you have to write that on your hand every day, right? Might not want to write it on your forehead, but if you want to write it on your forehead so you can see it every time you walk in, every time you look in the mirror, something like that, whatever it takes, remind yourself that no matter what, you have resilience. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here, right? You wouldn't be where you are right now. So remember that you are resilient. It's hardwired into who you are. So, and as I say that because I think especially in difficult times, we have to make sure that we find our resilience in small, simple acts and small parts of our attitudes, and really kind of shine a light on that so that it can keep us going. And it might be remaining calm. Some of us say, if we're not people who keep a calm demeanor, you notice people who keep a calm demeanor, or even just making it through the day, finding moments of normalcy and taking a deep breath and choosing to actually making the choice to bring your thoughts to the present. All of these things really do help you to shine a light on your own resilience, or even conversely, looking ahead and picturing a positive future while dealing with uncertainty and saying, hey, you know what, things aren't good right now, but I'm looking forward to something good happening later. And these are small but meaningful ways to regain some sense of control. And notice how with each new challenge, as you heard me talk about, you hang on and somehow you find your way, right? As I said, we all have this level of resilience in us. It's already there. It's just our job to remind ourselves of it and tap into it as much as possible. So some of these things, in order to help you to kind of hang on might be, switching your routines or tapping into creative solutions, those kind of things. And those things help us to accommodate what's asked of us. So looking for meaningful ways to respond rather than admitting defeat are really helpful. And so with every new challenge, you may wonder, what do I do when I reach my breaking point? But in fact, we've already found ways to regroup and rebalance, right? So that's always sometimes the fear when we're heading to an overwhelmed place, we start to think, okay, you know what, if I get to this place and we start to have those anxious thoughts that turn to those what if anxious thoughts that turn into that worst case scenario where we're so afraid of reaching our breaking point that we'll get to a place of no return, essentially. And so understanding that your resilience won't allow you to get there, if that makes sense. We know that in planting those seeds of resilience in ourselves and remembering that you're tapping into your resilience won't allow you to get there, doing that can be seen in all of the responses that you heard me talk about and all your responses to your challenges in life. You've persevered and you found the way forward every single time. So remember, resilience is there. It's within us, each and every one of us. And I think it's important to recognize that is also something that if you don't feel like you tap into it well, that you can grow it, right? You can, this is a skill that you can kind of build on and develop it and learn how to better manage it, especially in these stressful times. So simply practicing the actions and attitudes of resilience can really help strengthen your response to it, and it can make it more of a go-to even when stress is high. So there's a lot of research that points to several key areas to focus on to do this. So we're going to talk about those 4 P's of resilience now. So the 4 P's are perspective, purpose, people, and plasticity. So the first one is perspective. Let's check to see if there's any questions. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, right? So as Corey said, and you've seen in the chat box, this will be recorded. So if you lose anything or if you need to revisit it, I encourage you to listen to it and take notes, and not just listen to the information and take it in, but figure out ways to put the information into action. Because that's how you'll be able to actually develop and build your resilience so that you'll be able to manage things in a way that's healthier for you and more effective for you, especially whether you're doing it well now or not, essentially. So as we're talking about first, right, the first P in resilience is perspective. And it's easy to lose hope and momentum when your thoughts are filled from edge to edge with this uncertainty, right, where you're talking about worry and fear, right, and that anxiety is kind of just going and going and going. So we know that practicing a perspective shift, practicing any kind of new perspective can shift your interpretation of that stressor away from being something you're helpless to deal with. So the things you can do is, stay informed from the evolving guidelines of what's happening here to have, and trying to make sure that you have a clear picture of what's going on. Doing that can actually prime you to be more resilient in response by removing some of the unknowns. Our brains are hardwired to look at the unknown as dangerous. Our brains are hardwired to look at the unknowns as if we're not okay. And that's going to tap into our fight or flight every single time, right? This is where for those of you who have heard of that, right? Where when we're in danger, we're either going to run, we're going to fight. Our body and our brains are going to get us prepared to do that. It's going to shut down all non-essential functions, and it's going to get us to a place where we just need to survive. That's why sometimes when we get upset, we get into our fight or flight and we cut somebody out or tell them off. And then we have to go back and say, ooh, I could have done that a little bit differently. I could have said this. I didn't have to get so upset. And that's because your fight or flight was actually activated, essentially, and your ability to think and take the scenic route or critically think was shut down because all non-essential functions are shut down in those moments. So remembering, that the fear of the unknown or that unknown is going to do that, but if you allow yourself to stay informed, that tends to help. Also, focus on a meaningful response. When life seems chaotic and out of control, it may be helpful to ask different questions, right? Ask, how can I respond to this in a meaningful way, right? Making sure that you put that meaningful in there. And the answer might be joining a peaceful protest or something like that if you're talking about protesting or advocating for wrongs that are kind of going on. But the most important thing is asking yourself, what can I do that's going to bring meaning? How can I respond to this in a way that's meaningful to me? Note and reinforce what remains constant in your life. With so many changes that have happened, right? We know that stress has changed, and we can't get rid of stress, right? We can't get rid of, there's no way to get rid of stress because life brings change, right? There's no way. So it isn't about being stress free. It's about being able to manage the change in a way that's effective and beneficial to us. So you want to see what, try to tap into the things that you do have control over, the things that haven't changed for you, and hold on to some of the routines that you can, and that to help you create a sense of structure and stability, such as following your regular meal times or exercise schedules or study periods or anything like that. Any of those daily routines really can help, especially when you're dealing with a whole lot of change. So if you have something that's made a major change in life, then try to tap into and remember that everything isn't changing. There's some things that are the same, even if it's something as small as you wear the same bracelet every day, right? It doesn't matter what it is. Tapping into something that reminds you that you do have control over something really can help. Remember your capabilities. Look to the past for examples of how you've survived and thrived to support your perspective, right? I'm a person who can manage in a crisis, right? Telling yourself that and asking yourself, how did I do it? How did I do this before? How did I survive this difficult thing, this previous difficult thing, and make it to where I am now? And maybe it was taking care of others, or making a plan of action, or talking through the situation, or even just taking small steps. Sometimes we get so caught up in something, feeling like something needs to happen, that we want to take it all on and finish it all right now. So even taking small steps could help, and taking smaller bites of it and finishing it one step at a time, and recognizing that I got to finish this in order to get to that place that I'm nervous about getting to, right? I gotta pass this class, right? So that I can get to graduation, essentially, right? So I can get to the place where I get the job. So understanding that there's steps to it. And could these actions work again now? So asking yourself, if I shift my perspective enough to be able to say, hey, let me focus on what I need to do now, even though I'm planning for the future, focus on what I need to do now so that I can get to that place. All of those things could potentially help you now. And if it can, you want to remind yourself of that so you can get there. Know that you have already made it through so much, and these skills can help you in the coming days as well. We know that shifting your perspective can really help you really see that we may have more control than we realize. And those are some of the things you can do to help to shift that perspective, to make sure that there is more control in it. And oftentimes when we're feeling overwhelmed or feeling stressed, it's because we feel like we don't have control over that fear of the unknown, essentially. So the next one we want to talk about, or the next P of resilience, is purpose. You need, and you want to make sure that you have a sense of purpose of where you are, and where you plan to go, and why to move forward when it feels like the world is falling apart, or may feel like it's falling apart for you. So we know that purpose really does supply a valuable structure and momentum and stamina, even when we have to keep our heads down to get through today's challenges. So first thing you want to do is try to embrace who you are. And if you have trouble with that, again, this is where having a therapist is going to help. Remember that you are allowed to have what we consider weaknesses. You're allowed to have emotions. And that's one of the things we always try to shut down oftentimes. And we want to just say, I want to push through, because if I have an emotion, if I feel some kind of way, then I'm going to either look weak or look like, or feel weak, and it's not even about other people. It's about what we sometimes tell ourselves, right? If we're talking about emotional intelligence, we know that what we think influences how we feel, which drives what we do. So if we're telling ourselves that I'm weak, or because I have emotions, or I'm weak because I have this, then you're going to feel that way. And then your actions are going to show in response to that. So remember that it's okay to have emotions. It's okay to have whatever you might consider a weakness, and that you also have strengths, right? Being honest. And sometimes we say, I'm gonna keep it 100 with myself, and I'm gonna keep it real with myself and be honest with myself. But when we say that, we usually focus on the negative in that situation. We're saying, I'm just being real, I'm just keeping it honest. But that honesty isn't really balanced, and therefore it's not really honest all the time, right? If you're only focusing on either the all the way positive or all the way negative in regards to that. So be honest with yourself about what you can manage and you can't manage, about who you are, and embrace all of that, regardless of what that is. Set goals and make them realistic. Some of you may have heard of SMART goals, right? You want to make sure that taking on the whole of a challenging situation can really kind of be too much. And this is where I was saying before, maybe recognize that you got to take the first step in order to get to that end result, essentially. And so it can be hard sometimes and keep you from moving forward, because you can get stuck in your head with some of that anxiousness. So the question isn't how will I be able to live with this rather than how am I going to get through this today, right? This is, again, shifting your perspective and finding some level of purpose. And that's where you live for now, right? Maybe it's digging into a homework assignment, or maybe it's cooking a healthy meal, or you can start with some of those small goals to meet immediate needs and build on it slowly. You don't have to go from being zero to an expert in 30 minutes, essentially, or even in 30 days for that matter, depending on what it is that you're trying to get done. Offer support or assistance to others as well. Perhaps offering to pick up groceries or necessities or something like that can really help. And know that difficulty sometimes brings growth and meaning into our lives. And this is something that I could tell you I do personally. I always ask, hey, what did I learn from this, right? What can I take away from this? And if you look at every situation as a learning experience, it really can help to shift that perspective and find purpose in it, and understanding that, there's some growth that's going to come in it, right? There's some growth that could come from every given situation. And it can be hard to imagine that anything valuable could come from the experiences that we're currently in and any of the struggles that you're currently having. But at some point, you may notice that this hardship brought something into your life that could be considered meaningful, and that you will be able to use in the future as well. So it might impact your relationships for better, right? For the better, or help you find creative solutions to some of the problems, or you may see a strength in you that you didn't even know you had before. So it may just be the gift of discovering that you could survive it as well. And this helps you to build up in that resilience and have something to tap into for future difficult times. We know that finding your purpose can help you find firm footing among what might seem to be a little bit of chaos. So the next one we'll talk about is people, right? And I know this one's going to be a little bit more challenging as it relates to COVID and stay-at-home orders and isolations, and our brains kind of over the last year, us training our brains to see other people as dangerous, essentially. But some studies say that having and turning to people who we consider positive, or those positive relationships that we have in our lives during difficulty, may be the absolute most important factor in tapping into resilience. And this is why you hear me encouraging you. If you don't feel like you have people in your life who you can trust, or you have positive relationships, or where you can be your full self in that situation, this is where therapist is going to come in handy, right? And of course, I'm a little bit biased, but I do think that everyone should have one, because you'd be surprised how bogged down, like I said before, we get. And there's a space where you want to make sure you have a space where you feel like you're not going to be judged, or they're not going to put their biases on you, or you don't have to worry about offending somebody, or you don't have to worry about hurting their feelings if you're honest, essentially. So in those situations, that's the kind of interaction you want to have, somebody you can truly be your most authentic and natural and vulnerable self with. And we know that in having those relationships, we know that others can offer a safety net for us that helps us stop from hitting that bottom, right? To tap into that resilience, and allows us to bounce back. We know that support might be tangible things like a loan or a meal or tutoring, or they could be kind of like interpersonal, such as being a voice of reality, right? Or problem solving with us, or being an empathetic listener. All of these are some of the and actually more are resources that you could have if alone, or you wouldn't have if you were alone, essentially. We also know that other people can also help us see difficulties through a humorous lens, or even a different lens. And a trait noted in some more resilient people is there may be nothing funny about your current situation, but there may be small ways to still find humor or even some joy if you give yourself permission to do that, even joy in your life through connecting with others. So if you have a friend that you call them and y'all can laugh about things, give yourself permission to do that. Give yourself permission to enjoy these small moments if and when you find them, and recognize that we are all in the things that we're going through on the macro level, we're all in it together. Found ways to stay connected. In the digital age, I know some of us feel like we're not able to connect virtually. You've got to feel their presence. You got to feel the person's energy in person. But if you allow your brain to open up to this experience of being able to connect virtually, you can do that. You can still feel a person's energy if you allow yourself to be open to it and tap into that. And then also, the last thing I'll say is, in regards to people, is plan something to look forward to with others. Remember that the things that are going on right now, we're in this, and somebody called it the endemic, which I thought was cool. We're at the end of it. So there's times where we're going to be able to do things again. And I think it's important to make plans to do things and look forward, so that you can have something to look forward to. that helps us to build our level of resilience and find that purpose and find that and kind of solidify, I should say, that purpose and that we have in our lives by being able to have a plan in regards to something to look forward to. While we know, while how we connect might look different now, interacting with others still does help us to feel both grounded and uplifted, and a key form of support in these in the times that we're having now. So finding ways to really kind of tap into people is very important. The last P that I'll talk about today is our plasticity. And plasticity is when this is a fun one, right? And this is one that really helps us to tap into, in my opinion, our resilience. Our brains are wired to adapt. Our brains are wired to change. And so we grow and we learn every day. And when challenges strike, we need to tap this natural plasticity even more. And it can be even hard to be flexible and adaptable in situations because we find ourselves trying to control the situation more because we want to feel like, oh no, things are going awry. So I want to be able to control the things that I can. So you want to find small things that you can control in those moments, but recognize that it's also okay to be flexible and adaptable mentally. This is where we're talking about the perspective and being okay with widening your perspective and shifting your perspective in the face of uncertainty and loss and even in difficult emotions. And so there's a couple of things that can help. Take things day by day, right? People who don't give up have a habit of interpreting even some of the major setbacks as temporary, localized, and even changeable, essentially. Treat yourself with compassion. I know that sometimes we'll be more compassionate to others than we are to ourselves. Self-compassion is extremely important. This is when we're talking about when things get stressful, we often get harder on ourselves and our inner critic becomes very, very loud. We're telling ourselves, oh, I should have done this and oh, I should have done that. So I always tell people stop shoulding all over yourself because when you say should, you're telling yourself you've already failed. So remind yourself, hey, I need to stop shoulding all over myself, right? Yes, I'm not cursing, I know. I just think it's corny. That's my corny jokes. So I think it's important to recognize that, right? And then respond creatively, right? Not every change you face will look the same. So you don't have to respond with everything in the same way, but keep experimenting with new ways to solve problems. And don't be afraid to think outside the box and kind of allow yourself to change and try new things, essentially. If you find yourself feeling like you need to be stuck, that you are stuck and you're having trouble, this is where you tap into maybe one of the other 4 P's to help you to tap into this plasticity. Maybe people can help you do that. Shifting your perspective can help you do that as well. And you want to stay focused on the present. And we're going to actually, hopefully we have a couple of minutes to actually do one of my favorite tension releasing exercises in just a second. We know that we can actually, and that'll help us to stay present in this moment. We can actually train our brains to do this. And you may have heard of things called mindfulness, of course. It's a way of getting quiet and teaching ourselves to stay in the present. One of the most important things you can do in order to be able to feel like you can tap into your plasticity, right, is to stay present in this moment. And so there's a link to recorded sessions. There's a couple of handouts that you'll get after this. And one of those handouts is called, Building Balance, and there's an actual link on there as well. So there's a couple of things you can do to support your resilience and support resilience building by noticing and relieving some of the held in tensions, essentially. You can take some deep, slow breaths and you can do some visualizations, but one of my favorite is progressive muscle relaxation. I absolutely love it. So we got about a minute and a half and we'll do it. You'll see just how fast it is. So you can literally, you can put down your writing utensils for a second, right? And shake off all of the stress that you have for the day. And if you feel comfortable with me, go ahead and do this with me. Take a deep breath in, let it out. And when you let it out, you want to try to get all of the air out of your stomach. You might need to scrunch down a little bit. You're gonna breathe in again, breathe in even more air the second time. Keep going, don't hold your breath, let it out. And I'm going to ask you to squeeze your face. And you're going to squeeze as hard as you can until you feel yourself shaking a little bit. Squeeze. 1, 2, 3. Let it go. You're going to try to bring those shoulders up to your ears. You're going to squeeze till you feel yourself shaking a bit. 1, 2, 3. And release. You're going to do your arms and your hands. Squeeze till you feel them shaking. 1, 2, 3, let it go. You're going to put your elbows and you're going to try to touch your elbows behind your back. If you can't, that's okay. Neither can I. But you're just going to squeeze. 1, 2, 3, let it go. Now you're going to do your thighs and your butt. You're going to squeeze. 1, 2, 3, let it go. Now you're gonna do your calves. 1, 2, 3, and then those dogs. Let's squish them. Let's toes. Let's squeeze them. 1, 2, 3, let it go. Now, as they do that again, I absolutely love doing that. That's one of my favorite things. I feel better just showing you all to do it, not even do it all the way, right? And you see how fast it takes, like just how much time that took. It took us all of about 15 seconds, and I was showing you how to do it, right? So just think of how as you get used to doing that, right, that'll help you to stay present, and that'll help you to remember those 4 P's of resilience so that you can tap back into it. And this is something that, yes, I'll do this in between sessions, and there's times where you just take a deep breath, right? And allow yourself to be present in this moment. And you can use, again, one of my favorites, progressive muscle relaxation. You can also use your 5 senses. You can try to see 5 things, taste 5 things, touch 5 things, hear 5 things, and smell 5 things. And that'll help you to stay present as well. We know that taking care of yourself is really important as we move forward. You've heard people say, self-care, and that's important. So you get sleep and food, you eat healthy, and you try to exercise and all those things. The one thing I will say is you want to do those things in a way that doesn't force you to, that where you're not using it as a distraction from dealing with the mental and emotional experiences. So you don't want to go work out 24 hours a day and not deal with the frustration you feel from the change, if that makes sense, right? So you have all of these changes happening and you feel frustrated. For those of you who work with your non-dominant hand, and you feel frustrated, and you're like, oh, this change is frustrating me, and I hate it, and I don't want it, and all those things. Let me go work out. That's when you're using your workout as a distraction. So you don't want to do that. You want to say, hey, this is frustrating. This sucks. Let me feel this frustration. Let me acknowledge it and feel it, and then let it go. And then I can go work out, so I can deal with some of this. So I can use working out as a means to help me deal with the symptoms that were caused by the stress experience. Make sense? I know. Any thoughts or questions about anything that I've said so far? All right. So,
Dr. Lorrie, I was just going to say I love the progressive muscle relaxation, and I did participate even though I am on video. But I really do like that one, and it's funny because I think in my space, even with like recruitment and when we're coaching folks on interviews, I've used that one. I didn't use all of the elements you mentioned, so I'm gonna have to add a little bit more to the repertoire there. But like before you walk into a room or into a big meeting or into a big interview or something like that, and you need to run to the bathroom or at your desk at home, like do some of those muscle relaxations just to release the tension.
Right.
And it does make a big difference. So I appreciate you sharing that one and taking us through it too. So
yeah, how awesome is that? I do have one more too. So stand like a superhero. If you do go to the bathroom, if you're feeling a little bit like, oh, I don't know what's happening, I do watch superhero movies. Yes, I do like the Marvel movies. So if you stand like a superhero for 30 seconds, there is research. I'm not just making this up. It'll boost your resilience. It'll boost your mood as well. And so you stand there and you count to 30. Head up, shoulders down and back, hands on your hips. And that works as well. And yes, I've done it myself. So we know we've talked about resilience, we've talked about stress, we've talked about how to use resilience to manage stress, we talked about the differences between stress and anxiety. We've all these things that we've done today. Thank you, Corey, so much for having me here. I do hope that you all have an emotionally healthy day. Remember, we're all doing the best we can with what we have and where we are. So give yourself that space and give yourself that grace and self-compassion to be exactly where you are. Remember that resilience is in you. Tap into it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Lorrie. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Really some awesome points. Definitely took some notes. I will say that this video or session was recorded, so you all will be receiving a recording momentarily with a few additional links to check out. And take heed to everything that Dr. Miller said. And just take your time, take it slow. And I hope everyone just has a safe evening and rest of the week. Thank you all for joining us. Goodbye.